Hello and welcome to the first in a series of workshops around the topic of inclusive education. So first we'll be looking at what inclusive education is, and then having a look at some of our policy changes at Hobart Grammar and how we can use UDL to create more inclusive curricula. And finally, the first of a series of focus workshops on various aspects of student diversity, starting with gifted students. So here's a variety of ideas about what inclusive education might mean. So of course there's enrolling students with disabilities into regular schools, but it's also about taking into account individual needs and barriers to being included and participating as part of the learning community. Some points to consider about why diversity is important. First of all, what is the average student? Who are we actually teaching? It's analogous to a rainbow in that if you average out the colours of a rainbow, you get white. Well, similarly, the average Australian family has 2.1 kids. Now, who has 0.1 of a child? Nobody. So by focusing only on an average student, we're actually missing out on what student-centred learning is meant to be about, which is making sure that the learning is applicable and relevant to every student and achievable as well. Another argument for inclusive education is that schools should model society in its diversity. After all, we are preparing our students for life in the real world. So Australia has signed up to the UN Rights of the Child, which mention in Articles 28 and 29 the fundamental right of a student to access to education, and not only that, to education that helps them to develop to their fullest potential. In further details, the Salamanca Statement on education for people with special needs, and in that there is a further elaboration on the fact that we need to include students with special needs within our mainstream education system and provide a child-centred pedagogy that can meet those needs. And here locally in Australia, we see the same principles echoed in the Melbourne Declaration, where there is a focus there on creating an inclusive environment as well as bridging the gap to actively reduce the effect of disadvantage on students with a variety of special needs. And again, all of these aforementioned documents are cited by the Tasmanian Department of Education as the basis for their policies. So the Salamanca Declaration states, every child has unique characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. So what exactly are these differences among students? Well, here's a list of those factors according to Plowes and Whitburn, and importantly, the category of disability is further broken down by Conway into cognitive, sensory, physical, and social emotional, and these are all aspects that we'll be covering in individual workshops. And as you can see, those various aspects of student diversity are well reflected in our own school policy with a specific local emphasis. So how do we rate as a school with respect to our obligations for inclusive education? Well, as you can see, our recent audit uncovered a lot of strengths. However, one of the weaknesses that we're trying to address today is the fact that we have a retrospective approach to curriculum design and lesson planning for inclusive education. So in response to the findings of that audit, we re-examined our inclusive education policy, and in particular the fact that we originally recognised that differentiation of the curriculum was the best way to go about including students with special needs. And we're going to be shifting towards what's known as a universal design for learning. But before we all start to panic, we're not getting rid of our personalised learning plans or our curriculum differentiation. but rather we're recognising that we need to be building in inclusivity into our baseline curriculum, that which we're offering to all students. And if we get this right, we'll find that there is less need for curriculum differentiation and personalised learning plans because more students are having their needs met by the baseline curriculum. So in our curriculum review, we'll be using CAP's adaptation of Universal Design for Learning, and in it the first element is the goal. In other words, every lesson plan will need a clear learning goal linked to the Australian curriculum, but decoupled from the means of demonstrating that learning. And that's where we start to look at the flexibility required for inclusive education. And the following three key elements after that are representation, how the learning material is represented in different ways to suit different students, expression, in terms of the way that we express ourselves to students, and also the way in which students can demonstrate their knowledge in different ways. And finally, engagement, which is about providing multiple ways of learning, so different activities that a student can choose according to their interests and needs. So here's an overview of what we'll be doing in future workshops. The rest of this one will be focusing on gifted students. I'll be looking at a definition of giftedness, some common misconceptions and challenges, implications for our curriculum, and how we can identify and differentiate for the exceptional gifted student. So Garnier's differentiated model for giftedness separates giftedness from talent, where giftedness is defined as having natural abilities in those various domains listed that are in the top 10% of the overall population. And in this model, what's emphasised is that potential may not be realised unless we have the right catalysts within the student as well as within their environment. So a lot of the misconceptions around gifted students stems from the fact that often we only really see the talented ones, the ones who've been able to cope with an education system that doesn't fulfil their needs and thrive and succeed anyway. But in reality, there are many gifted children who are struggling, and they present in terms of behaviour problems. Socially, they're not fitting in, and they're just cruising and underachieving because they're not challenged in class. When we talk about the problems and challenges of asynchronous development, it's easier to imagine the problems faced by a 15-year-old with the mental age of a 3-year-old. Just imagine some of those problems that student would face. Well, asynchronous development is also a problem for gifted students. Obviously, the nature of the problem is different, but they can be just as significant. So before we look at the Universal Design for Learning and how it applies to gifted students, it's important to look at how we already differentiate for those exceptional students. So Maker's model, which we've been using, looks at differentiating the curriculum at the level of content, process, product, and environment. So now when we look at how do we apply the Universal Design for Learning for gifted students, what we can do is take some of those differentiations and actually incorporate them into the mainstream curriculum. For example, when we look at goal, yes, we need to link the learning objective to the Australian curriculum, but we can add extensions and complexities which allow for our gifted students to extend themselves. When we look at representation, we can look at presenting learning material in more open-ended, messy, real-life ways. We can build in more challenging ways for the student to express their learning achievement. And finally, provide multiple learning experiences, some of which are more self-directed, some of which require students to make more higher order thinking decisions. So while we can provide that basic flexibility in our curriculum, there will be gifted students who are extraordinary and have extraordinary needs. And the sooner we can identify them, the better, because those intrapersonal and environmental catalysts can be negative and can cause them to slide into those patterns of underachieving that we mentioned earlier. So early identification can prevent those problems from accumulating. Twice exceptional students are particularly vulnerable to underachievement and also harder to identify. An example of a twice exceptional student is somebody with a behavioural problem who also happens to be gifted in a certain area. So because of their behavioural problem, it makes it a lot harder to see that expression of their natural talent. So we've had a look at some of the practical tools that we can use to incorporate the needs of gifted students in our curriculum review, in our universal design for learning. And we've also seen the importance of identifying students who may actually be at risk because of their giftedness. So what we need to do then is start off the process of identification by nominating those students for further observation and testing. So I'll leave off there with just a preliminary list of some of the resources that we will be using during our curriculum review. Of course, we'll be adding to this as we go, and I look forward to future workshops where we'll be looking at other aspects of student diversity. And finally, just a bit of admin. There are all the references which have been used in this presentation for anyone who'd like to look them up and inquire a little further into some of the claims that I've made throughout the presentation. Okay, thank you, and I look forward to the next workshop.